Hi, Martin.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great, and I'm so glad we have another opportunity to talk about Optimize the Moment.
Me too,
Lots to talk about.
as always.
Yeah, so just remind me a little bit about what you're up to right now and let the audience know a little bit more about yourself.
Well, as usual, I'm advising clients, large companies, small companies, and as usual, I'm leveraging what I've learned over the last 25 years or so, which is what brought me to write the book, Optimize the Moment. I've spent 25 years or so working in war zones and post-conflict zones and working with a variety of great companies. And that experience has given me a pretty unique line of sight and vantage point into what has worked and worked well, and in some cases what has not worked so well, through some very turbulent times. And as you know, we are in some very turbulent times, and I'm working with a lot of great companies through those turbulent times. And there are some common themes that we can pull out over those I don't want to use the word crises. I could have called the book Surviving a Crisis, but I didn't want to do that. I really felt that wasn't going to give it justice, right, to the people, the teams, the organizations at the time. And so it was so much more than that. The things that they lived through and worked through were so much more impactful than that. They were moments. So I spent actually quite a bit of time in the book talking about what those moments are, what they were, and how those individuals that I witnessed and had a chance to work with really seized those moments and rose above. And that's why I use the term optimize. So they optimize those moments. And so I work with a lot of great people and teams and organizations today to help them optimize the moments today.
And we're going to focus today on decision making. So, leadership, decision making, ordinary people doing extraordinary things by making the right decision in the right moment, optimizing the moment. Could you share some real life examples of this that are current?
Well, every day there are examples of people who get decision making right, and frankly, others that have a long way to go.
Mm-hmm.
So I was talking with somebody just yesterday about the organization they work for. Happens to be a large global organization.
Mm-hmm.
In a technology field, a very well-known organization. Everyone would know it, and yet this individual has worked there for a little over a year. And what he told me was, since January, he's had 3 different managers,
Whoa.
2 different vice presidents, 2 different executive vice presidents. He said that in the last year, the entire plan has changed 4 or 5 times. That morale of this relatively new team that's been pulled together since last year, the morale is very, very low because they feel like, his words, not mine, everything they have done to this point is for naught.
Mm-hmm.
That it really has been kind of a waste, because what they're being told now is that they have to focus on a new plan. And everything they've done so far is kind of out the window, and they just now need to focus on the new plan. That the new leadership that's in has a new plan, and they have to drop what they're doing and do something else. As a result, 3 of the senior people have quit. 3 of the tech people have left, which again has had an impact on their culture, on the team.
Sure.
And others obviously are considering leaving as well. So that decision making around what's their mission,
Yeah.
what are they trying to accomplish, how to build and motivate that team, has really fallen apart, clearly, over the course of the last year, and certainly since the beginning of this year. that's a real world example. I hear this kind of thing all too often, and it doesn't matter whether they're large organizations or small organizations. It happens far too frequently, and it doesn't need to happen. There are better ways of approaching these things. Just because new people come into the organization doesn't mean they have to throw out everything that's been before. Mm-hmm. And it's up to the leadership of that organization to really define what they're there, what their core competencies are, what they're all about, why they're there, and why what the team is there to accomplish, and how they're supposed to get there.
Do you, by any chance, know if the new incoming leaders, at least for the team, asked the team what they thought the way forward was?
Yeah, I know that they didn't, and I know that one of the new people in reached back to the organization they had left, right, and recruited a handful of people from his previous company. So now you've got a handful of people that used to work together at the previous company, now at this new company. So now you've got two cultures, conflicting with one another. So a handful of people kind of at the top who used to work together at the previous company, and this team that's been there together for the last year, learning to work together, learning new skills, learning to building some great things, doing great work together, now being told everything they've done is for naught.
So it sounds like the meaning of cross currents and two oceans, and we know how that stirs up the water.
It does.
And it becomes treacherous. And so in terms of an application for the business, what would you recommend if they were seeking your guidance on an approach to move forward successfully and retain that talent that they've invested money in training?
So obviously the first thing is to be aware that you've got a problem.
Fair.
And I know that might sound trite or straightforward, but not a lot of organizations do kind of self-reflect and realize that they've got that problem. The second is essentially the reason why I wrote the book, and that understanding that you have that problem, there is an approach, there's a methodology to doing it. So gut reactions, instincts, traditional business models, levers, those things don't work. And so just saying, here's a new project, get to work, get it done, is not going to happen. That's not going to work. All that's going to result from that is that they're going to lose more people. Mm-hmm. If you don't stop and recognize or listen to the people who are there that, as I said, that morale is low. So if you don't recognize that the morale is low, you don't listen to them, you don't understand why, you're not going to fix it. So instead, following an optimize the moment kind of approach, mm-hmm. where you do kind of listen, recognize what that problem is, redefine the mission, help them understand what their role is in that mission, put some timelines to it, because unless they begin to achieve success together, they're not going to be motivated to get out of bed in the morning and come together as a team.
It's perfect. And so you talked earlier about turbulence. It sounds like this is creating the status quo is creating the turbulence in the mindset of this organization, and that it's leading to a lot of change, and they're not bringing people on board effectively with that change.
I would argue there are a number of organizations that have known nothing but turbulence and chaos for the last 2 or 3 years. Mm. And they have just been throwing one thing against the wall after another, hoping something would stick. And you and I have talked about this before, but yeah. It's kind of management by gut reaction, by instinct. People saying, I know my business, or I know my market, or he or she knows the business, let's try that. Business by trial and error clearly isn't working. People are leaving, senior people are leaving. I'm seeing one reorganization after another. Share prices are all over the place as a result when we see a plan after a plan after a plan. And so, shareholders are very uneasy. Stakeholders are uneasy. Suppliers are uneasy. I'm seeing things where, suppliers are not getting paid. And so things like that bubble to the top.
And is that just oversight or incompetence or a bigger problem?
I think, all of these things are symptoms, and they're symptoms of bigger problems. And I go back to this notion of decision making, that the business models and the levers that leaders, CEOs used to be able to rely on, right? These things were pretty patent. The models, how things got done, were, if not cast in stone, they were pretty much cast in stone.
Yeah.
You could rely on, how bills got paid, how revenues came in, where they came from. If something slipped in the system, you could pretty much pick it out. A lot of those business models no longer apply today. You can't just push on the button and expect them to work. As a result, a lot of these leaders are scrambling. And in that turbulence, in that chaos, they are struggling for what to do. Therefore, again, one of the reasons why I wrote the book and wrote it now is to say that we need new decision making. And it's an approach. It's a whole different, let's take a step back, let's think about how we do things differently. I'm proposing an approach in the book. Absolutely, I am. But I'm under no illusion. It's not the only approach, right? So if the book provokes a whole discussion around that kind of decision making and what needs to be done in the crucible of those, okay, let's call them crises and that chaos, absolutely, then all the better for it. But the first thing that needs to happen is that these boards in particular and the C-suites need to recognize and be aware of the fact that they've got a problem.
Is it a governance problem?
Absolutely.
Yeah. You have a lot of expertise around governance.
Yeah.
Can you basically just provide a brief frame of how this can work? Because that interplay between CEOs and boards is really, really important for an organization. And status quo seems to be something. I heard a great quote lately that said the status quo, people will prefer to stay with the status quo even though they know disaster is looming because they haven't yet experienced a disaster. And there's something about our brains that doesn't quite worry about something until it's had the experience. Your experience has been, especially in conflict zones, in seeing disaster unfold in real time and the aftermath of disaster. And it seems to me that whether it's a conflict zone or a boardroom, similar kind of formulas can apply to make those decision-making moments have a greater impact for the greater good.
So there's a lot in that question. So I've done it both ways.
You can manage it. I know you can.
The subtext to the name of the book is From War Zones to Boardrooms. So I've actually used governance and governance models in war zones and in parliaments to help in very chaotic and very difficult scenarios, to help find order, to help find a process to decision making that was at times where no one thought it was possible.
Yeah.
To find those things that were those things that people could accomplish, where security was an issue, where bombs were going off, where those big, hairy, impossible issues were just beyond anybody's imagination. But we still use governance, and in some cases, full-on legislative governance,
Yes.
To find things that really moved the ball. So in Iraq, we were able to find legislation that put kids back in schools, got doctors back to work, got professors back to work, got electricity going back on in dark neighborhoods, which was a real game changer.
Sure.
And a number of other things which at the time may have seemed like small things, but the cumulative effect of being able to help do those things over the course of even 1 year, let alone 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, really did change the game. So I've done it that way around, but with boards, and you're talking about the status quo and being resistant to change. I sat on a board recently where the chair and the vice chair of the board literally refused basic governance things because they just wanted to react. They wanted to react to the situation and shrug their shoulders and said, yeah, I'm not doing that. I'm just not doing it. And in so doing, set the organization back, 2 years, 3 years, in basic financial fundamentals and basic sort of decision making, just because they could not wrap their heads around how important it was for the organization and the viability of the organization to do things properly, and just to have a basic order to things. 1A plus B plus C equals D, right?
Yeah.
Like it doesn't, governance doesn't have to be a huge volume or body of law. It's just a basic system of first you do one thing, then you do the next thing, then you do the next thing, and there just has to be some boundaries, and that's kind of it to start with.
So just listening to you say this, what I think is really fascinating about it is, first of all, when you're talking about the forward progress, the irony here is that the market really likes stability. Stability
Yes.
is the antithesis of chaos. It seems that in the pre-geopolitical realignment, pre-pandemic, growth strategies were what drove everybody forward, and that you had to grow, grow, grow. But it seems from listening to you now that with the example that you gave is that core stability starts from the ground up, and you're building a foundation of that.
Yeah.
And that requires a longer timeline, does it not?
It actually doesn't. If you can show people that you're taking steps toward doing something like governance, it gives them comfort. And volunteer boards are a great example of that, right? Because it's one thing in a corporation where people are paid and there's money and people are vested.
Yes.
In a volunteer board, people not only give of their money, but they give of their time.
Yes.
And it's a real testament to how well that board is doing with their leadership. So if you can show that you're taking steps with governance, not just organizing events and planning parties and doing all the fun stuff, people see that and they recognize that you're actually doing the right things. They may not agree with everything that you're doing. Yeah. That's okay. But at least you're taking the steps and you're making the effort to do things properly. So I sit on another board with you where in the very, very early days following some chaos, it was really important to show that we were taking those steps with governance. Hadn't done it yet, hadn't finished it, hadn't put a whole lot of check marks on the wall, but it sure made a big difference to the membership. And people who were writing some of the checks and support, continuing to support that organization, that we were demonstrating that we were committed to doing the right things, as opposed to the other organization I'm talking about,
yes,
where they just shrugged their shoulders and says, yeah, no, we're not doing that.
Sounds like there's a lot of ego in that. And when you are taking the steps to demonstrate at least someone is looking out for you, it is a good way to bring people on board, pun intended, of course.
Yeah.
But it also, I think people sometimes forget on a volunteer board that there's a fiduciary duty, and you can be held liable. So if you're not getting paid, you're volunteering your time, you certainly don't want to put your neck on the line for a lack of oversight and good governance, and at least in making progress in stabilizing whatever it is that you have to do.
Principles matter. And having principles and having ethics matter. And it's not just about whether or not you get caught and thrown in jail. It's actually about demonstrating to your stakeholders and your shareholders and your membership and your employees and your suppliers and everybody that you're committed to actually doing things properly. You have that, as you said, your fiduciary responsibility to be stewards and be caretakers of the organization, not just the money. Yes, the money, but not just the money, the whole, the history and the tradition and all of the things that came before.
Okay, so there are two words in there I want to pivot with. One is turbulence, the other is stewards and stewardesses.
I know where you're going with this.
Yes, because it's been in the news, and I think a lot of people would love to get your advice on how this case study could have been better handled, and we're talking about Boeing.
Yes.
Does this has refreshed the audience right now that they're in deep trouble?
Boeing is in deep trouble and have been for a long time. As the audience will know, 2 aircraft, 737 MAX, actually crashed. The tragedy, of course, the very sad part is that 346 souls were lost.
Including Canadians.
Including
so
Canadians.
Americans, Canadians.
And actually many other nationalities as well. Both passengers and crew.
Yes.
So that first and foremost is the sad tragedy.
And you can't take that back.
That
no
can
fixing
never.
that.
There is no punishment. There is no fine. There is no.
Yeah.
There's nothing that can be done to wind that back. There, as you said, there will be case studies. There will be business studies. There will be all sorts of things, articles, books. There's been a Netflix series. There's been a PBS series. There's been a 60 Minutes, documentary on this, and no doubt there will be others. From my perspective, this goes back to I think 2016, when the C-suite took a proposal to the board and asked for permission or approval, not permission, approval, to outsource the engineering and design of the aircraft. 80% of the aircraft.
Does that mean they're relinquishing control?
So keep in mind what Boeing was up until that point. They were an engineering and design company. So think about that in terms of what does Apple do? And we've talked about this before.
Yeah.
Apple at its
Core.
to use a pun, is a design company. And Steve Jobs was very clear that as a design company, they were focusing on their customer experience and making sure that they were to enhance their customer experience. Other people made PCs and did the other kinds of aspects of the technology, but their piece was the design. And we said all along, Apple could have made washing machines or literally anything else, and people would have lined up around the block to buy it because they would have focused on the design piece that made it special. At its core, Boeing was an engineering and design company. And so I think people will look back on this whole story and look back at that moment when they decided to outsource offshore the engineering design, 80% of it, of that aircraft as being the critical moment when they ceased to be an engineering and design firm.
That's really interesting, Martin. That's a great insight.
And at that point, really began the demise of the company and set in motion a series of other decisions and a cascade of other moments and other events ultimately that led to the crash of those two aircraft. It could have easily been several other aircraft. In 2019, the FAA intervened and grounded all the aircraft. It was the longest grounding in history. As you know, with the order, Boeing did not respond appropriately.
Well, they had, I guess, a deferred prosecution agreement, and 3 days short of that expiring is when the door blew off of the 747 MAX.
In 2024,
Correct?
earlier this year.
Yeah.
So, but they lied. They did not provide the information they were supposed to. The information that they did provide had been doctored, and all of which has come about this week in a plea deal
Yeah.
around criminal conspiracy. So they have pled guilty. It's one of the first times in history that a company like this has pled guilty to criminal conspiracy around. So not only did they make the initial decisions that led to the terrible and tragic events, but then they conspired to not work with officials and to cover it up, and they have pled guilty to doing so. So people will go to jail. There will be people in jail. There'll be people fined. Obviously, as we've said, none of which can wind back the clock and make recompense for the tragedy and the carnage that has been left, along the way. We're talking about a number of years here, but it is a case study, for sure, in how not to make business decisions at pretty much every step of the way.
Yeah, every step of the way.
The piece that I wanted to focus on, though, is that initial decision that really fundamentally changed the culture of the company.
Yeah.
That by outsourcing the engineering and design of those aircraft, and they ceased in that moment, to be their core competency and kind of who they are and what they are, and everything that they have done to build Boeing to its greatness, they began the process of tearing out the culture of that organization.
So to substantiate what you're saying and your insight and observation of where it went wrong and the decision making, I just want to provide some context to our listeners here. So in April, Boeing whistleblowers, including Sam Selapur, quality engineer at the company. Quality engineer. It's exactly what you're talking about. They outsource that. So they still had some internal engineers. He testified to lawmakers over safety concerns. And exactly to what you're saying, he said, despite what Boeing officials state publicly, there is no safety culture at Boeing. And employees like me who speak up about defects with its production activities and lack of quality control are ignored, marginalized, threatened, sidelined, and worse. So, and he said this under oath.
Yeah.
And it comes back to even what you said with your example and who you were talking to yesterday. It's that decision making. It is the culture of the company. And as people who wake up, who you need to motivate to wake up and get out of bed every day to be the best they can be so you all win together. There's a parallel here between the two stories.
Absolutely there is. And you can overlay the governance conversation in this too, right? So when you do things properly and there's a bit of order and a bit of sense to things, and again, I'm not talking about phone book size legislation that bureaucratizes things. That's not what I'm talking about.
No, yeah.
I'm just saying that people need a mission. They need to know what their role is in that mission. That there's some training around how to accomplish that they can rely on that. a path, right, to how they get there. Inherent in that is a culture and a pride. You know, in Boeing's sense, the entire organization had been built on that knowledge and expertise of the design and the engineering that built the engines and the aircraft, and it was they were tremendously proud of that history over a very, very long period of time. And I'm saying that in that moment, the board chose earnings per share and short-termism and outsourcing. And it wasn't the only outsourcing decision, right? Companies at the time
Sure.
were outsourcing everything.
Yes.
They were outsourcing HR and pensions and any function of the company that they could outsource and offshore in order to maximize the earnings per share of the company in that in the effort to increase their earnings per share. And that short-termism is something that a lot of organizations and experts have written about. The Institute for Corporate Directors has published papers about it and spoken very publicly about it. And it has had such a dramatic and detrimental effect on the culture of organizations and how decisions are made. So companies today, in extraordinarily turbulent times, cannot rely on things being easy, right? They just can't. Those business models, I would argue, didn't work before. They certainly aren't working now. And the workforce today isn't going to put up with that kind of nonsense. They're just not. We live in an age of accountability and transparency and higher expectations. Mm-hmm. And they're going to walk out the door. Just like the person I was talking to yesterday, his colleagues said, you know what? We don't like what we're seeing. So we're gone. We're out of here. Because they know they can take those skills that are highly transferable, mm-hmm. and they're gone. So businesses have a lot of lessons to learn here. They better get their governance right. They better get their decision-making right. They better define what it is that they're here for and build that culture around driving those missions and motivating people properly.
And leading by example.
And walking the walk.
Walking the walk. I mean, the irony here is when you talk about the shareholder value and the decision-making to increase shareholder value, what are the shares doing today? Like in the long run, and depending on your timeline, to your point, short-termism is not very rewarding. And it sounds as though the standard of excellence for Boeing prior to that decision, the standard of excellence for whatever it was that drew the talent to this person's company in the tech industry, and I know you have a lot of experience in tech, in security and defense, this is not good for democracy.
It's not good for anybody. So, I mean, the irony here is the only people who care about short-term earnings per share are investment analysts. If you're an investor, you're working with an investment advisor, somebody, right? Everything they teach us is about long-term investing. No one is taking you by the hand, with your RRSP or your tax-free savings account or your kids' RESP and saying, it's all about the next 3 months, right? No one is doing that. They're all talking about, saving for the long term, understanding where the value is, right? And having a balanced portfolio. So the only people who care about this short-termism are the boards of directors and the investment analysts who are trying to drive those earnings per share, those corporate profits, I would argue, because that's how they get paid.
Exactly. That's their incentive.
That's their incentive. They are incented to drive profitability and earnings per share because that's how they get paid, not actually for the benefit of shareholders. if they were motivated to benefit shareholders in the long run, they would be making long-term decisions.
I think it also speaks to the point of culture.
Again,
Yes, when you're producing mediocrity with impunity, it's not going to inspire anyone. And when you talk about the leadership and the decision made in this, whether you are an employer or an employee or a citizen or a parent or a partner, this short-termism and the self-serving approach to running anything does have a really profound impact on the psyche of the people surrounding you. So your point about culture and team building, I feel that needs to be explored in another podcast.
it does. Well, and it's fundamentally dishonest because there are all sorts of things that you can do to make your earnings look good in any given quarter.
Yes.
But in the long run, maybe the financial health of the company isn't great. But if you want to make it look, shiny and new in this quarter, that they can do that, right?
Sure.
But it's not honest. It's not a fair representation. And so you find organizations incented to do that, and it's like, well, we'll worry about next quarter. We'll worry about the third quarter in the third quarter. We'll worry about the fourth quarter in the fourth quarter. As we've talked about before, I grew up in that world. I grew up in the world where we were given impossible targets, and then it was management's job to go around and kind of push people into achieving those targets. What have you sold today? What have you sold this morning? What have you sold this afternoon? And it was always push. And it created absolutely the wrong culture, and it pushed people to do things, frankly, that were dishonest, that broke the governance rules, right? That it incented just the wrong kind of behavior. And as a result, you ended up with, those 50, 60, 70-hour work weeks and all of the other social problems that went along with it. And so today, people like my kids, they don't want any part of that.
Yeah.
They're just
Fair.
not going to put up with it. And I
Fair.
don't blame them a bit, right? They're motivated by other things. They want a work-life balance. They're prepared to, maybe not make quite as much money to have a better work-life balance. And frankly, fantastic.
And still deliver.
So they'll focus on delivering a better quality,
Yeah.
right? And as we started out with, that culture is everything. And they'll change. They'll move, right? And we stayed with companies for a long time.
Yeah.
But if the culture is not there for them in that age group, they'll move. They'll move tomorrow.
It's true. We have a much more flexible, nimble workforce that is not afraid of adventure, that has, I think, a fair amount of experience or exposure to having moved already, because it's a byproduct of globalization, which is now moving a little bit in the other direction in terms of protectionism. And it seems as though, I guess, the next generation and the people in the culture now are best suited to figure it out. And it sounds to me as though what you're saying is CEOs and leaders would be well served to listen to the people who they want to be on their team, to be able to attract real talent, and more importantly, to retain real talent, because there's a cost attached to training people, as you said before, and to familiarizing them. They're not as productive when they're starting off on a new job. So back to your first case study example of the person you spoke to yesterday and advised. Mm-hmm. I imagine the productivity is very low because the turnover is so high. So it's in no one's interest to have that kind of culture.
So for people who want to build highly productive teams today, the good news is it is absolutely possible. And there are some companies that are getting it right. So, part of what I do, every day in advising companies I work with some great companies that are doing some fabulous things. And in the book, I talk about some of them, and there are others that have a long way to go. But there are some common characteristics, and the ones that, and I use what is a military command similar structure in the methodology that I approach, because there are some, and I've witnessed some tremendous benefits to those, both working in war zones and in working in post-conflict zones and in working with companies that define what that mission is. Not a mission statement that hangs on a wall or is on a website that people can't relate to.
Action over words you're talking about.
I'm talking very much about action over words, things that people can achieve, things that are very task-oriented, but also pulling together the team of people that can achieve it.
Yeah.
So I also see organizations that have a lot of legacy people that don't buy in. So it is about moving people, not necessarily letting them go, but moving the teams around and moving the people around to be on the right teams so that they are culturally aligned to achieve those missions and get things done. It's amazing how motivated some people can be, and they want to jump out of bed in the morning once they've started achieving things together. And there's a great organization I work with, and some of the team members are, well...
What's your organization? Can you say?
No, I can't.
Okay.
But I'm going to say that a couple of the team members in particular are well past retirement age, but they're full of vim and vigor.
Yeah.
But having moved around, the people to create a couple different teams, they're now on teams and they're achieving things where they weren't before. And now they're jumping out of bed because now they're actually seeing progress. They have a purpose. The purpose is defined, and in that purpose, they can see what their role is.
Nice.
Right? And culturally, they didn't know what their role was before. They were just doing a job before. So for a long time, maybe for years and years, they were just showing up to do a job. Now, they're part of a team. They know what their role is on that team. They have a purpose, and they're having fun because together they're actually accomplishing things. What a difference a bit of organization and a different kind of plan and a different approach. I mean, it's just simply a different approach. Mm-hmm. And so the same number of people organized differently around a different approach is shooting the lights out compared to their competitors, compared to what they were doing a year or two ago. And wow, being creative in how they do things and what they're doing, it's fantastic.
That agility sounds brilliant because you don't have to retrain people about the culture of your organization or what the mission is. You just have to get them in with the right fit so they have a win every day. And when people have wins, it becomes addictive.
They do know that they can rely on their training. They do know that they have a mission. They understand what the mission is. They understand what the role is. They have a very clear understanding of what the culture is. And when they achieve that mission, they go on to achieve the next one. And that's part of a bigger plan, right? And it does work. But you can't just send people out and say, go make us money.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just not a plan. It's not going to work. And yet, that's what I see happening all the time.
Well, I like the delineated roles. I like the team building. You're talking about mission and a lot of things that we need to pin until next time, because I'd like to just have you share a lot of the questions people may have now listening to this conversation are answered in your book. So how can they get your book?
Optimize the Moment is available on Amazon, whether you're in the US or the UK or here in Canada. It's also available here in Canada at Indigo and Indigo Online. and at Barnes & Noble in the U.S. and Waterstones in the U.K. And also in Australia and elsewhere.
So wherever anyone lives and would like to get a copy of it, they can go on to your website at Optimize the Moment
Yes.
and find anything they need to know about how to get the book, a little bit more about what's in it, and we'll explore another chapter in our next podcast.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it.
Okay. It's great chatting with you, Martin.
Always nice chatting with you.
Thanks for the insights. Really appreciate them.
Thank you.